Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, we are conducting a wrap-up episode from our 1,000 Plateaus reading group. The plateau that we read is of the refrain. And so we are going to get into concepts in that particular plateau, things like rhythm, harmony, chaos, a theory of transcoding, and so on and so on. But before we get to any of that, along for the ride today is somebody who's basically helping us out quite a bit on the back end here at Acid Horizon, and that is Noah, who's been a member of the reading group, and now they are in charge of our Discord server, and they've also been helping to conduct our Bataille reading group, in which we will soon be reading The Accursed Share. So I'll let Noah say a few things about that. Noah, what's up with the Discord and the reading group, and what are the plans going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. Well, it's been a real pleasure kind of having a little space to talk about not just the podcasts and the contents of the podcast, but the various reading groups that we have going on. Like you said, the 1,000 Plateaus that's been happening since January, and the summer Bataille, what you could call a Bataille and context reading group, where I helped put a little syllabus together, and that is sort of mediated through the Discord channel, and HAP takes place on Zoom. The Bataille and context was strategically to help us get into one of the more famous books on Bataille's part, which is The Accursed Share. We walked through a number of big picture topics and had some wonderful members that hopefully we'll maybe continue to see in the next reading group. But sometime in October, we're going to start reading with The Accursed Share. The syllabus has been posted in the Discord channel for the reading group with side texts that we'll be reading alongside that will hopefully give us some tensions, help us identify some refrains, even in some of the subjects that we're covering. And shout out to everyone who's been reading that with us in the past couple months. And I'm excited to keep going on that.
Yeah, and we really want to thank you for your help. And just to make things clear, with Acid Horizon, you can become a patron at any level and hop into our 1,000 Plateaus reading group or the main reading group. But many of us here are poor students, so we've created a facility by which to fund our educations. And so if you pop in at the mid-tier level, you get to be a member of the Discord and those other groups, and you can access any of those videos. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that for now. Is there anything else that we wanted to add, Adam or Will, on that?
No,
Well,
just that I think that like the Discord is also really cool because I've noticed there's just a lot of like material that I've not come across, floating in the Foucault channel and stuff like that. So it's always fun. It's always fun to be challenged in there too.
And just to add on to the Bataille reading group, I mean, this one says reading group, but it's also in many ways crossed with a full-on research seminar. I mean, the syllabus is syllabi, sorry, that no one of us in Discord put together was really fantastic. I mean, you got the in-depth anthropological side of Bataille that puts in both in communication with existing literature as also as intention with it. And it's also just, the very foundation of what Bataille was trying to do, which is about creating communities of thought and imagination. And I got a feeling for that. It was great. I'm looking forward to where we're going with it.
And in the end, it becomes like a living and dynamic document that anybody who's a member can access at any time. And, you can get things to support your research interests. So please join us if you can. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and let's start today's discussion of Deleuze and Guattari's Of the Refrain. This is an interesting plateau. We're talking about the sonarity of Ariadne's thread, the strand that helps support us amidst the chaos of the universe. And to start us off, Adam's going to give us a little spiel on grounding, which relates directly to this notion of being able to stand oneself up by virtue of Ariadne's thread. So go ahead.
So this plateau is overall about the philosophical question of grounding, which is something that Deleuze, even in his very earliest texts, for example, the essay "What is Grounding," really tries to focus on. It's about the ideas of how do things consolidate insofar as they express the kind of qualities that they do. How do they become what they are and maintain themselves in constantly being what they are through the passage of time and through various different territories in space. And this question of grounding, traditionally in philosophy, I mean, if you go back to Plato, always puts the unity of the thing, the grounding formal qualities of the thing that make it what it is, behind or before the object. This is in Plato's theory of forms, of course, where every chair is only a chair as a particular chair insofar as, say, a form, platonic form of something is that which really grounds it. and undergirds it, so to speak. And of course, later on we have Aristotle with his hylomorphism. Everything in the material world is what it is insofar as there is a form impressed onto it. The classical example being the impression of a seal upon wax. The matter is formless, and then the matter is formed by impression. In that sense, the formal element is the unifying, or it's part the hylomorphic principle, which Deleuze and Guattari very much challenge in other plateaus, like the nomadology plateau. It's all about holding things together in this way. And of course, later on, you have Kant, where what the unity of the object, why the object is what it is, the laws of the object, and all possible objectivity are contained within us, within the presuppositions, or what he calls the transcendental structure of experience, the conditions of possibility for experiencing any object, which are themselves fixed before us and can never change insofar as they are always the same for humans. He does actually say that maybe aliens have something different. Whereas I think with the consolidation in this plateau, Brent Adkins, in one of his books on Deleuze and Guattari, makes this very clear. He puts this very well. He says that it's tackling the problem of consolidation in media res, in the middle of the thing. And this plateau is about the various rhythms and vibrations of matter and how they consolidate themselves into qualities that are repeated or that endure throughout its various encounters with a very chaotic and open and very diverse and differentiating universe. So overall, the very problem of consolidation, the problem of holding things as they really are, and it's almost like that Bill Hicks joke. There's the Bill Hicks joke about, why is there never any good news? It's okay, here's some good news. A hippie took some mescaline today and discovered that all we are is matter condensed to a very slow vibration, and therefore all things are one, and we are the universe experiencing itself. And it's a little bit like that insofar as they're thinking about vibrations, thinking about matter in terms of these vibratory patterns or oscillations of being within time, not to go too Heideggerian about it. And this, of course, goes very much to the idea that Deleuze gets from Duns Scotus, that being is univocal. Being speaks with one voice, of course, but being speaks with one voice, but the various different volumes and various different meters, various different rhythms, and various different refrains, choruses. And it's those choruses really that signify for Deleuze and Guattari what is moving, what is operating within a territory, what sort of time and space patterns are continuing, and how they preserve themselves not only against different kinds of things, but also through those different kind of things and through difference itself.
Great. Noah, since you're our guest today, what were your impressions of this plateau or your big takeaways?
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult and long text, I would say, just at the forefront, as are most of the plateaus. I would say this one stands out a little bit because it feels like it's going on and on at times. But upon rereading it for this session, and also going and checking out different resources like Deleuze for the Desperate, looking at the transcript there, looking at what texts are highlighted there, like visiting the Machinic Unconscious, where Guattari spends time alone writing about the refrain, and other various videos and papers that they've written collaboratively or individually. I think it's something that's constantly come up, a refrain, if you will, is that this is one of their favorite or most important concepts. And it's interesting to hear that because, when you're scrolling through the table of contents for this book, I feel like refrain doesn't really stick out, at least as to someone who's not familiar with Deleuze and Guattari. And like you see cool things like the war machine or nomadology or rhizome, but refrain is interesting here because they're trying to do something really big, really philosophical with it, which is understanding what is machinic about the communication between animals and plants and humans and different processes that they work through, as opposed to having some sort of subjective human meaning applied to many of the different ways we or other what they would call transcendental philosophers kind of try how they try to frame the world. And there's interesting things that come about with art and with music here that I found very interesting. And there's this one line on page 345 and 344 of the book where they talk about the more rare, when they're talking in the context of art and drawing and painting, the more rarefied the atmosphere, the more disparate the elements you will find. Your synthesis of disparate elements will be all the stronger if you proceed with a sober gesture. An act of consistency, capture, or extraction works in a material that is not meager but prodigiously simplified, creatively limited, and been selected. And then they say, for there is no imagination outside of technique, which was really interesting to me because I'm kind of, as an artist, I'm looking at some of these abstract painters and abstract artists, and I'm like, why doesn't this resonate with me? Or why is these sort of like just random shapes? Why doesn't this connect? Why am I not interested in this? Why am I interested in other types of art that are more focused on technique or anatomy or very specific types of ways of showing values or perspective or things like that? And there's something very sober about, you could say, about going through that process of creating art, of focusing on the technique, on being very intentional with what you're doing. And I think that resonated with me, and I actually missed that the first time. And because they talk about there's this sort of valorization of children's art sometimes, or the music that they make, where it's just kind of rambling nonsense or scribbles. And there's an emphasis, they say, where you should and don't try to make things fuzzy, they say. And thankfully the Deleuze for the Desperate kind of helped me reveal this in the text. Don't make things fuzzy. Try to find what is fuzzy and make it visible. And there's some sort of there's like a positive project there that they kind of see the refrain as being useful for. And it was interesting to me that they are speaking out against, just like, just bunch of little lines is not necessarily useful for us. And I don't know, so I was just kind of that stuck out to me. And there's more to say about how they're trying to use the refrain, like what Adam said, to ground or to have to do something in what they call the chaosmos. Like we need something, or maybe we don't need, but there is something that kind of structures it, which might be the refrain in these different territories.
Great. Will, how about you?
I'm always startled by the moment, also on 345, when Deleuze's notion of the people to come simply bursts into the plateau, because I think that is one of the fundamental elements of, if there is some sort of politic in relation to the future, it comes back to this ability to step in to the middle, or en medio, as Agamben would say, or milieu, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, and give an account of a sort of radical potentiality. But at the same time, I also think that of the refrain is not only formative for their concept of territoriality and milieu, but also I think really important for how they understand the cybernetic. Like I think that the way in which they display the function of rhythm and harmony and its relation to nomos is really crucial. And maybe later in the discussion, I can be insufferable and provide, a bad philology of harmonia in Plato and nomoi in Plato's The Laws, and try to sort of break apart what these two functions do in music that they also replicate in the government of the self and the government of others. I think that far from being hyper technical, and I know sometimes it really does feel like you are in the milieu of this of this plateau. It is quite long and often very dry, but there are moments where I think if there is a sort of, if you share a kind of political commitment with Deleuze and Guattari, you're going to see many of those commitments and, I guess, political intensities manifest. Because I think here we start to see precisely what a Deleuze-Guattarian cosmopolitical project would look like. And it's not at all, I think, like the way in which we conventionally understand the cosmopolitan, right? And for that reason, I think it remains underappreciated. A final note would just be the once again the quick relation to childhood in this plateau, where it opens with the figure of the child who sings to themselves in order so that they can launch themselves forward, either into a task or into a place of safety, and so on. And one really interesting citation in this opening is to Nand Delaney, who was a sort of guerrilla psychological thinker who worked with disabled children, autistic children, and schizophrenic children, provided in 1968 this concept of the line of life, or the line of straying. And it was important and formative to Agamben's formulation of desubjectivation. So I think that really when it comes to the political, the subject, ontology, and the history of metaphysics from Aristotle to Heidegger, this plateau really does attempt to sort of bring all of these things together and provide a very clear, articulable political mode of resistance, which I think can be described very simply as different rhythms. That's my opening shtick.
Just listening to everyone here, there's so many ways that you can read this plateau, and there's so many hairs to chase down. And I think one of the ways that I'd like to conduct myself just in this conversation is just listening to what stood out to everyone else and maybe kind of bringing those strands together. And I mean, there's kind of a rhyme there with the notion of Ariadne's thread. What makes this conversation hang together is a thread that goes through all of it. And for those who don't maybe perhaps remember what Ariadne's thread is, perhaps you remember the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. Theseus goes into the labyrinth to kill the Minotaur, and he uses Ariadne's thread as a way to find himself out of the labyrinth once that happens. And the interesting connection here is with things that we've been working on is the way that Bataille and Deleuze and Guattari treat the notion of Ariadne's thread. It's pretty clear to me that part of Bataille's practical political program is finding both a way and the courage to give up Ariadne's thread so that we can experience the kind of diffuse immensity that awaits our transformation or awaits the limit experience. Deleuze and Guattari are in 1,000 Plateaus consistently err on the side of caution. And here they're doing that once again. They do it in the Body Without Organs plateau. They're doing it here. And I think it's important, this notion of Ariadne's thread is important to their notion of the construction of interiority. And one of the images that they present is the idea of a hearth and a home as being a kind of interior that's constructed. A hearth and a home are not a priori things in the world. They are made up of things of the social unconscious or the social milieu. And even something like the law constructs itself as a kind of interiority. And this is something that you might have heard me talk about in previous episodes with respect to Kafka and that story Before the Law, where the man from the country comes to the law to find out what lies behind the law. Well, the fundamental presupposition that he takes with him on his journey is that the law has an inside and it's transcendent. And because of that, and because of that presupposition, he ends up suffering as a result and falling victim to the traps of the law, as it were. But I like the idea of interiority as a construction of sonorous, gestural motor lines, loops, knots, speeds, movements. Think about, honey, I'm home. You come through the door, you hear the door slam, the cat's there, you see the kids at the table, that kind of thing. For many people, the whole tableau of the home environment is this assemblage of little refrains, things that you hear the TV on in the background, the cat's meow, and so on and so forth. And I think the idea, and I like Will and Noah both pointing out the thing about childhood is that the idea of a refrain creates this sort of sonic eddy by which we generate a kind of propulsion to move us into certain kinds of tasks and to keep us safe. And so there is this element of a kind of protection, a safety, a net, an Ariadne's thread that accompanies any sort of risky or courageous political practice that we might undertake. And it's something that Deleuze and Guattari encourage us to think about. Some things I'd like to talk about are maybe chaos, territory, but I'll let Adam sort of lead the discussion from here. Maybe there's something he wants to say.
Well, one thing I want to bring up actually about the refrain as a kind of a musical signaling of the consistency that one wants to achieve, the idea that you basically in these little songs you declare a sort of territory for yourself, you cut out the chaos and mark a sort of territory of your own, while at the same time opening yourself up to have the kind of stability with which you can interact with the wider world, including resisting it, is very much helped by the fact that Deleuze and Guattari linked this to the natal, to natality. A refrain signals a kind of origin for them. A little song once, even Honey, I'm Home, it signals a very sort of masculine religion like a traditional marriage. I mean, at least in your voice, Craig, it signals a masculine origin, a man that is home, who has been born, who has material existence and has a consistent existence, or at least signals the potential of a history. And one of the examples Deleuze and Guattari give actually is salmon. The idea that a lot of animals have homing instincts. They can go for miles and miles to find breeding grounds. The idea of the refrains, their consistency as the beings that they are, also contains a reference to an origin. And to go back to our episode on Adorno and Fred Moten, I think the sound character of refrains here is very much important for how we can read maybe something like how Moten reads the notion of screaming and noising the scream and noise in Black Performance. Everything from, as he says, James Brown's scream, say, even at the beginning of one of those popular songs like I Feel Good, to the analysis of the scream that he gives in the break of Frederick Douglass's account of his Aunt Hester, who screams upon being beaten by a slaver. And the idea is for Moten that in this scream, it signals that the commodity that speaks, that is the slave, is not reducible to exchange value. There is a material value that signals a personality, a humanity to it, and that signals that there is a materiality. And Moten is very good here. He splits the word materiality into mater, reality. So mater, using a pun on the Latin mater for mother, and then materiality. And this goes back to, look, I was born, I have an origin, I have people, I have a people, if not present, to come in a revolution against this. And this is very much in line with the analysis of slavery as natal alienation, abduction from mother, from mother, abduction from origins, abduction from the life that has material value in and of itself and of an essential quality. No, not essentialist, that has been ripped away by the forces of slavery and capitalism. So I just thought that was a very interesting connection to bring about there. The idea of signaling origins and how the idea of the refrain harkens back to something, whilst at the same time allowing you to open up, to stabilize yourself and open up new possibilities of interaction. Another way of thinking about this as well is the idea of qualitative markers. A refrain signals a quality that one wants to hold on to guide you as if it is Ariadne's thread. The child sings a song to remind themselves in the way that they are still a child, and they can, this world is malleable, they can make their way through this, they can hold on to something.
I like what keeps coming up again and again. You've just been talking about it a bit, Adam, and Will mentioned it too, is this idea of in media res, in medio, or the concept of the milieu. In other places in Deleuze's work and Deleuze and Guattari's work, they mention the importance of this concept as one that's capable of undermining certain kinds of political forces, namely the force of symbology that we see in psychoanalysis, the Oedipal reduction, right? Think of anyone, maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody you know who's had a psychological breakdown. And then there's a kind of intervention that happens. And maybe that intervention is medicalized in some way. Maybe it involves getting a therapist. Well, what happens in that moment is the intervention, if it's a psychoanalytic one, involves you going to see a therapist, taking account of your symptoms, diagnosing and so forth. And if you're doing a traditional psychoanalysis or maybe a Jungian psychoanalysis, there might be some talk of Oedipus, or there might be some talk of archetypes or something like that. And often the discussion that ensues, and perhaps in like the turn of the century or the early part of the 20th century, psychoanalysis is this sort of leading away from the event or from the site of the breakdown, from the middle, from the in media res, the milieu, as it were. And this is something that Deleuze diagnoses as one of the problems of psychoanalysis, is that it makes exigent things that are not in that middle. It imposes upon us, for example, the law of Oedipus. And so a more successful therapeutics would be something that takes account of things that are already in the middle. So it's not that we are moving towards an a priori psychoanalytic structure, an Oedipal structure, and that is everything's going to point to that origin. The concept of origin that is at work here has to do with the numerous intensities, the numerous components, the numerous refrains that compose any sort of political milieu.
So Benjamin's Berlin Chronicles, I know this is like so bad to just like shoot to another text, like, is a text where what one finds is the necessity that in order to really be an expert in any given thing, in order to understand it, one has to be able to capture it in the midst of one's complete impotence in relation to it, to be completely absorbed within it. And I think that Marcello Tari actually discusses this specifically in relation to Deleuze's conception of the milieu. It's not just a being at center, but the refrain and, you know, this is a common thread in philosophical and phenomenal and generally specifically phenomenological work, right? Like Heidegger famously uses essentially this example to describe hearkening, right? A fundamental element of the construction of space for that ontology for Heidegger is the concept of hearkening, right? Pure sound is something that for Heidegger, I think he uses the word, a very particular kind of mind can hear pure sound. But the noise of a backfiring of a motorcycle requires one to already be in the middle of an entire scenario, right? One sitting in a cafe, one is holding a cup of tea, and a backfiring of a motorcycle shakes your hand because it's meant to abruptly displace the entire flow of sound that has come to constitute the continuity of that interior space. But also at the same time, you know, the refrain is a helpful way to understand not just the side of political activity, but it's also a framework into conceptions of trauma as well, right? Like the hearing of the backfiring of a motorcycle, it startles you. You know, the the honey I'm home and the door opening already has within it a particular historicity. So I think that the concept of Medeo for specifically for Agamben is in relation to understanding pure means. Like it is fundamental to his his political project, but more importantly, the question of desubjectivation as well. So I think that there's a lot to be said about the history of this notion of the middle. But I think that what is interesting here is, and I should make it clear, like this plateau is quite critical of Heidegger's conception of grounding, even if it's not directly engaging with Heidegger critically. But yeah, this is a concept that Deleuze and Guattari have sapped, I think, from the history of philosophy that has existed as a fundamental element in the very possibility of experience. The refrain is in some ways the condition of possibility for experience as such.
Absolutely, and it stands not only in the middle of desubjectivation, the becoming, or taking away the subjectivity you already have and wanting to consolidate another one, but also in providing a refrain, a chorus that reconsolidates the same kind of subjectivity, the same kind of experience. Because the idea of, I mean, this ultimately goes to, the refrain is something that is very much not necessarily inherently human, but is also very much tied to animals and the world of expression in forms of marking one's territory. The qualitative markers that are expressed in one's territory can be urinary, or as Brent Adkins gives the example of non-territorial animals, the white-tailed deer, where the shaking of the white tails it runs marks it as the sort of animal that is non-territorial in the way that it is. And in many ways, the I of I think is a qualitative marker. So Deleuze and Guattari, I mean, especially Deleuze, is going back to the problematic of Hume, the idea that the self is just a bundle of experiences and perceptions that habituates itself, that has the habit of marking off a certain cutoff point and saying, this is the I, this is my personal identity. And there are certain refrains and certain rhythms on which we identify with some things as part of our experience rather than others. We delineate the inner and outer sense. But I mean, the refrains, I mean, I wonder if refrains can be both conservative and revolutionary in various degrees, partially because we have I've been hearing one refrain quite a lot the past few days. So what happened when old Liz kicked the bucket? We had the Prime Minister, Liz Truss, for now, come out, and there's this great bit of uncertainty, and suddenly you hear this refrain that not only as Deleuze and Guattari takes away the chaos of this massive void now, where the Queen is no longer here, the Hegelian constitutional unity of the state is gone. But then a certain refrain kicks in, and suddenly all of the lovely little heavily subjectivated Reichian little subjects of microfascism say the following refrain: God save the king. That is a refrain. It's something that people don't know the whole fucking song. They know this one little section, which is more or less the chorus, and that is the refrain of subjectivation that consolidates the ideological power, or in Deleuze Guattarian terms, the cathexis, the libidinal investment of collective desire into this great monstrous imperial machine that is the monarchy. I think if one example of a refrain, God save the king. Of course, I'm making a great use of the use and mention distinction. I'm definitely not using that phrase. I'm only mentioning it. Is a great paradigmatic example now.
The problem was that the Internationale was not memorable enough. If it was simply catchier and easier to memorize.
Yeah, just before I get to what I was going to say, briefly on the Queens, like the statement, God save the king, or rest in peace, or whenever the king dies, they say it follows it up with long live the king, implying the continuity of the crown and the royalty, right? The metonymical aspect rather than the metaphor of the crown. And it's sort of reinforcing the territory, you could say, of royalty, of imperialism, which is really interesting. But I kind of want to go back to the idea of like the refrain as something that kind of you take your territory with you. There's this wonderful part on the Deleuze to the Desperate where Dave Harris kind of points out that like leaving your territory is dangerous because it risks exposing you or challenging your view of yourself as something competent or someone competent. And that's threatening to the ego, right? You go into a new milieu, you could call it a new anything, something that you're unfamiliar with, and it's hard to just do that, to just raw dog reality in that sense. So you bring your things with you. You bring your little songs, your headphones, right? And like you could make the analogy of the Stranger Things where you listen to the music to get out of the scary place, right? And the upside down or something like that. And there's also what Dave Harris calls a more positive implication that he gets from the Guattari reader, which is that refrains can actually construct territories, which has kind of come up here and now in the conversation, and that there's it's what he says, selecting, and he's quoting them, selecting out dominant themes from the surrounding flux. As the big thing for them is flux and flow of energy and matter and desires, right? And I think it's interesting because like also harkening back to what Will said following on page 345 about the people to come, there is a positive political project that one can use the refrain for, which is constructing your own refrains, right? Or constructing new refrains. The question now in my mind of how do we create a community also has to have an answer to how do we create a refrain, or what refrains do we need in our community or in our new political project. And so on that page there's like do we dwell as a poet or an assassin, for instance, which is very interesting, right? And thanks for pointing that page out, well, because there's a sense of like there's not just, it's like interesting that he phrases a people to come. Is that what Nietzsche's idea of like the greater man, right? Are we going to get over all of our problems at some point, and not just like physically but like mentally? And there's this idea, he talks about how we interact with the cosmos, how the government interacts with the cosmos. So like this cosmo-political project that Will pointed out, I think it's interesting, and like we need some refrains, like we need some. And is Acid Horizon's meme generating capacities, is that a refrain enough? I don't know, right?
Well, I mean, Nick Land is the enemy. Stop sending him anime recommendations. All right. But beyond that, I think that actually the answer to your question is actually posed in the comment you made at the very beginning of this episode about finding what is fuzzy and allowing for like a particular unfolding or uncovering, find what is fuzzy and render it clear. I think that that's and that's sort of the brilliance of certain readings of the people to come, is that like they're here, they're the lost children of today, right? And I think that that's sort of why I find this articulation of rhythm, harmony, and melody to be like of absolute importance. Like it was of fundamental importance that Plato's Republic provide an articulation of harmony as that which constitutes the good for Callipolis. And this has maintained itself as we've worked through various forms of sovereign power, disciplinary power, control. The problem of kybernetica, right, of steering the ship, has remained with us in our understanding of the government of others. And that's why I think that every time we talk about like the melodic formula, right? Or the nome or nomoi, what we have to seek out are fundamentally different rhythms. And this actually may mean displacing a refrain, right? It may mean positing a refrain in a territory where that refrain breaks down the functionality and the harmony of that entire system, right? That which it cannot carry, right? And I think Frederick Lordon's problem with ACAB is precisely the proof of the insipid problems of the elements of the left that simply want to deliver a new, harmonious, entirely orchestrated mode of life. And this refrain, right, of the hatred of police, not of just the police, but of police as such, policing as such, is the intolerable, horrendous nightmare to the most insipid, but also most placid and pallid Leninists of our day. Is there are moments where so much can be reabsorbed and rearticulated, right? Like so much of what we posit as critique only strengthens the very thing that it seeks to take down. But there are these handful of moments throughout history where a refrain reaches a point of intolerability, of complete and utter undeniability of the present state and stakes of the situation, that it cannot be incorporated into the general harmonious production of good subjectivated citizens without tearing down all of the things that link subjects to power. So for that reason, I think the refrain is a helpful concept.
You know, there's an aesthetic realization of what you're talking about, Will. I've often referred to the work of electronic musician Heimbach, who has done something what is called destruction or destructive loops, where he will take loops often of, you know, like horrible news events, you know, politically lambastable sound bites, and he'll commit them to tape. And then he'll run the tape around his studio and just have a razor sit ever so lightly against the loops as they play, and they get destroyed over time. And then, you know, after running it through delays and reverbs and other filters, you get this sort of sonorous, sort of ambient glow as the loop breaks down, which I think is really beautiful. I also wanted to offer somewhat of a counterpoint, not on the point of police, but just on the point of refrains in general, is that, and we talked about this in the group too, is that sometimes, whether it's artistically or maybe even politically, a refrain can get you through the uncertainty too. And I think we discussed this when, you know, for example, when composing a piece of music, especially like something like techno or house or drum and bass, is that if you don't know where to go next with a buildup or a breakdown, it's often advisable just repeat the melody line. Maybe just get a different timbre in there, or maybe break it down somewhat, but keep the general structure and then either reharmonize or build up around it. And then sometimes you can even pull back the refrain after doing that. Once you've had that sort of as a scaffold to get to the next phase, you're like, oh, now I know where I can go with this. So, you know, once again, refrains, not inherently good or bad, sometimes need to be stripped away depending on the sort of political milieu that we're in. Sometimes they can be at least a temporary guiding light.
Just something that, I was reading The Machine and Unconscious before this, and the chapter on the refrain, and there's an interesting point that they make on 108, or Guattari makes, that the simplification of the basic rhythms of temporalization, what I call refrain, Guattari says, can lead to an impoverishment. And they mention in the universe of capitalist refrains, everyone lives in the same rhythm, in the same accelerated cadences. And so there's ways that refrains get hijacked, right? I thought that was interesting that the political, like there are refrains that touch all of us, right? We live in the territory that capitalism has sort of created for itself, and just how that is going to help me think about, I don't know, how finance operate, or how international banking operates, and interest rates, et cetera, recessions, how that connects to us, right? What refrains do we hear or do we interact with? And so again, it's very political what they're talking about here, because they're letting us look at what is fuzzy and understand who is deciding what things aren't going to be fuzzy and what things are going to be fuzzy is a political project, I think, which is interesting.
Well, go for it.
I think too, like I put this in the like little chat that we have next to the discussion for people who, the reason why it's come up is, I think that one of the things too is that refrains, even if they are, let's say, like fundamentally a roadblock to political motion to liberate something, right? The smallest force in the farthest place can be enough to change the way in which that refrain functions. So I was thinking of the album by Alvin Lucier, I'm Sitting Alone in a Room, or I'm Sitting in a Room, where the slightest alteration of tone replicated over the same refrain, I am sitting alone in a room different than the one you are now, eventually breaks down the entire the entire structure of the refrain and leaves like a low hum at the very end of. So I think that this structure of refrain is really helpful in trying to understand like what people mean by like short circuiting, second order cybernetics.
As we move towards a closure, we have a few, maybe 12 minutes left or so. Were there other topics we didn't really touch upon chaos yet, or we didn't dig down into it? Because what Deleuze and Guattari say is that chaos is the milieu of all milieus. And we didn't really unpack the complete theory of milieu that they have here, but essentially they have what they call an interior and intermediary and annexed forms of milieus. So maybe the sort of one or two sentence version of that is that milieus overlap. And it's often the case that sometimes one milieu might be the basis for an entire other milieu, a creation of a higher order milieu and so forth. But at the edge of all milieus, or the outside of all milieus, is this notion of chaos, which I know for some theorists of chaos, Deleuze and Guattari's notion of chaos is not one that jibes with them. For Deleuze and Guattari, the notion of chaos is one that is creative. And when we talk about the fuzzy, if we look at what is philosophy, the text by Deleuze and Guattari, in the very final pages of that, they talk about the brain being plunged into a kind of chaos. And they also talk about different disciplines such as science, art, and philosophy as occupying regions of this chaos, but overlapping. And there might be a sort of fuzzy interstice, for example, between literature and philosophy, between science and philosophy, between the fine arts and literature and so forth. And it's in that interstice and in those ambiguities that a certain kind of play happens where the new is created. And Noah, you have something on that.
Yeah, just briefly, something that's interesting that we need to remember, I mean, that I try to remember constantly, is that the chaosmos for Guattari and Deleuze is sort of like the law of the universe for them, right? There is no center, there is no real superstructure or structure, there's no God. And so it seems to me that they're trying to understand how things come about through that, right? Without trying to project, like I said earlier, a human meaning on it. And it might be framed as a sort of like a survival mechanism to create a refrain, right? They go through all the instances of how animals are interacting with other animals or plants, or the wasp and the orchid, right? Things of that nature. It's really like an instinct, like, of life, to sort of create a refrain, to survive chaos, to sort of navigate through kind of what you're talking about, this very chaotic world. What Dave Harris calls the refrain restores a center to a threatening and turbulent scenario or situation. And so I'm trying, going into this, I'm trying to be like, okay, what is their point here? As I've asked with every plateau, like there's ones that are very political or very anthropological. There's ones that are very epistemological, perhaps, or just and very vaguely philosophical. This one seems to be them trying to understand the mechanisms of how the world works, perhaps, of some sort. I don't know if you want to call it a metaphysics, but it's something like that kind of is guiding their ontology of various things. And that to me was helpful to understand why we needed to read this.
Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the notion of chaos, going back to its original sort of Greek meaning, is sort of this yawning opening. And I think it very much is, for Deleuze and Guattari, you're saying, no, that there's no center. The universe is not revolving around a single unifying, totalizing principle. It's not a totality that is close, but rather it is an open whole. It's about how we navigate that. Or it's about, certain predominant tendencies in any being, or any pattern of being, or any pattern of organization or pattern of life, which try to solidify themselves. And this is why one of the qualitative markers that we can think of that can be expressed in refrain is a subjectivity, is a kind of mindless, this is who I am. If you want to say a revolutionary subject, someone walking down the street saying, whose street, our streets. Or say for the Irish Republican movement, something like a Chocky Allah, our day will come, very much as a refrain in that setting. And ultimately, I think, just to go back to back to basics, I guess. I mean, just to go back to the idea of a milieu. A milieu is a quote, a block of space-time constituted by the periodic repetition of the components. Now, what's the component? The component really is the sort of what bears this periodic repetition of matter and of qualities and of expressing those qualities. And they say every milieu is coded, a code being defined by periodic repetition. Code is simply a repeated pattern that one can look at and say, okay, here's a certain motion, here's a certain, let's say, scales in music maybe, or something that we can, if repeated enough, we can recognize as a semi-consistent form that can be consolidated over time. And the refrains are something to help us navigate this chaos. And this goes back to the theory of art they present in this chapter, and that is the idea that art is fundamentally a poster, essentially a marking of the territory, putting something up that expresses a qualitative aspect that corresponds to something in the thing that's doing the expressing, in the person, in the animal. They say, to quote, fish are posters. They can mark their territory. And I find it very sort of funny in a way that the image that accompanies this plateau on the first page is, I believe it's Klee or Duchamp.
Clee's the
twittering machine. Yeah, see, it's this line drawing made out of a selection of birds linked and presented in, especially with the title, as some sort of machine. The twittering is a way of marking a territory, similar way as the cat marks its territory. Honey, I'm home. Mark some place as home and someone as honey. Even it doesn't get people to come. We have, in Britain now with the ongoing strikes, there is that the movement, or at least the refrain of enough is enough. And that is a refrain which sort of marks a territory out. It's a refrain that if you go on to a protest, there's always a musical element to a protest, or a symbol, or a refrain element to it. There's essentially going to be a chorus that articulates a demand. And these demands are always articulated, as a lot of protests are, in the blocking off of certain territories, the blocking off of highways, blocking off of roads, blocking off of patterns in which we are all constantly kept moving throughout the chaotic anarchy of capitalist production. But at the same time, the idea is to block off these passages so as to cause damage, to short circuit them, to overload capacities of the circuits of production and control in a certain area. And this is why, of course, these flows have to be restored by the police. This is why they do kettling. They lock you away in a zone of exception where essentially the rest of society moves around you. And refrains, in a way, are one way of keeping things unified, and trying to reclaim that territory that the police cut you off from by making that your own. And I think the use of refrains is fundamentally, I think, the use of protest, the use of organizing revolutions, even if those revolutionary forces may not be able to contain them. To go back to the example of Lenin that Will brought up, think about, peace, bread and land, all power to the Soviets. These functions, or these refrains, were encouraged by the Bolsheviks insofar as they were also expecting, for example, revolutions in Germany to break out and to be successful. Lenin was very explicit that he was expecting this unified apparatus to be something that would be dismantled with the help of other places. However, given that there was the Soviet Union, or Russia at least, was on its own in a period of constant international civil war on all sides, that didn't end up happening.
Yeah, there's some overlap too with this plateau and like Will is saying in the side chat here, with the postulates of linguistics, Lenin, and like just the phrase too, workers of the world unite, the concept of a slogan as maybe a special kind of refrain in some sense. And as you were talking, Adam, it made me think how does a protest differ from a riot at the ontological level? Well, in some respects, it might be that a protest is a constructed space, a constituent space that attempts to create a territory on the basis of refrains. But not only that, of course, you have the mass of people. And what is a riot? It's a complete disruption of all refrains. But maybe we'll go towards wrapping up. Final thoughts. We'll start with Noah, who's the guest. Anything that you want to say before we close it down?
Yeah, this is a difficult paper to read. It's 30-40 pages, and as Will kind of pointed out, it gets dry at various points, but there's lots of little things to grab in it. Like the first time I read it, I must have been skimming because I didn't even see the part about like sober art making or of like the scribbles of children. I think it's you could argue that you could read this refrain, or you could read this plateau first before the rhizome, and then kind of go out on any sort of path. I've enjoyed the discussion. I'm looking forward to what we're going to read next, and hopefully this will help me pick out some refrains of my own, or find ones I want to get rid of.
There you go. Adam, how about you?
Yeah, this plateau is massive. It covers everything from Guattari's interests in the study of birds to general animal studies. Of course, Will mention cybernetics. They're very much influenced by the works of Jakob von Uexküll, who has this idea of the Umwelt, which is the around world or the environment, and the idea of something also gets picked up by cyberneticists like Gregory Bateson, the idea that a mind is actually part of a system between the animal and its environment, and actually you can only see them in totality and how they respond to each other. The mind is bigger than itself in a way, and it gets kind of extended. And there are so many amazing layers to this refrain plateau. And we didn't cover a lot of the stuff on the classical composers, German Romanticism. This is a very rich plateau, and I think there's a lot to get from it. It does get very dry at points, but annoyingly for such a plateau that has a lot of dryness in many respects, it does contain many of the concepts that they were most proud of. Deleuze in the Abécédaire, in the O for opera section, he says that people ask me and Felix what concepts have we created. We say that philosophy is about creating concepts, and what concept have we created? And the example he gives is the refrain, ritornello. So I think this is probably one of the most central plateaus for Deleuze and Guattari, which is annoying, right? Because in many ways, it's not the sexiest plateau. It's not no methodological war machines or rhizomes that cause any sort of controversies between him and Alain Badiou or something like that. It's not the most famous, but then again, in that case, it's the one whose consequences we're yet to see as a resource for both being and acting, especially in our contemporary milieu, so to speak.
The one thing that we didn't get into that I really like about this plateau is the way that they distinguish between the concept of milieu and the concept of territory. And I think that one of the most familiar pieces of conceptual terminology that Deleuze and Guattari are known for is this concept of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. And often these terms get bandied about in a way that often loses their conceptual rigor. And sometimes we simply need to use them as a shorthand. But fortunately, they give us the details of, like what differentiates a milieu from a territory? How does one milieu pass into another? How might one become the basis for another? And they build that up. I think someone whose work is helpful in understanding this is, as Adam said, Jacob van Uexküll, who I recently read about again in The Open with Agamben, especially in his scientific work with animals. I think if you're looking at that work and then looking at this particular refrain, would make for a great research project about animality, about cybernetics, about territory, about political economy even.
I think I'll just close off with a small refrain. I think at minimum, what we have to understand the absolute call for any sort of contemporary project that seeks to establish like an ontological imbalance within what is really an accelerating cybernetic program is simply a politics of different rhythms. And one can find this in everything from Zarathustra to Tikkun's cybernetic hypothesis in the early 2000s and late 90s. The absolute insurmountable confrontation between different rhythms, I think, constitutes the potentiality for the manifestation of a different form of life.